Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 22nd of November 2023. Coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G7URP. Lovely to see you, and I'm very sorry we're late. We had a few technical issues to resolve with our guest, who we look forward to seeing in a little while. I think we've found a workaround of that. So anyway, before we meet Fred, on with the show. And this is what we've got for you this evening. On the show tonight, we have Fred VE1FA, who's going to tell us all about air sea rescue and the Gibson Girl transmitter from World War II. We're going to tell you about some events happening for Christmas with NARC. And we're going to find out.
I think it's just frozen.
Right, we have some technical problems now, which is ironic, for the first time ever. And we're going to find out what on earth this is. Oh, they say bad rehearsal, good performance, don't they? Right. But anyway, never mind, the rehearsal went fine. Anyway, there we are. All right, sorry for that. We hope it can only get better from here. We're going to start with club news. And first we have some contest update from Malcolm G3PDH, and he says the results for the last data contest were published on Monday, and as expected NARC had a clear win, pushing our overall lead out to about 16,000 points. The recent SSB session was very close with Sheffield, but they had several M6 and M7 and a 2E0 on their team, so their bonus points will result in a Sheffield win. But we were also down on the usual number of logs, said Malcolm. Anyway, the last contest in the Auto Series takes place tomorrow, the Thursday, 23rd of November, and it's CW. Now, I did mention it last time we were here on NARC Live, and we're now taking membership for 2024. I won't tell you or go through everything that I did last time, except to say it's still £10 a year for this year, which is a lot less than it ever was before. But we do look upon all of you who've been a member this year, pleased to renew, because it's the numbers that mean that we can offer membership cheaper than it's been for, well, decades, literally, actually. So it's £10 per person for the year, and that's the details of how to pay us. All those details are also on our website and on newsletters as well. So please pay as soon as you can for 2024 membership. And it means that we can cover all our costs and things next year as well. Particularly our biggest cost is hiring the school, as I'm sure you realise. There's the details. And don't forget to email Mark, please, when you join, because sometimes he doesn't see any details of who's paid. Thank you very much. Now on to Christmas 2023. I can dare mention that. It feels like it's ages away, but of course it isn't. And we've got two particular events for you. Firstly, on Wednesday the 13th of December. Now this is our last meeting in person at CNS School. And of course most of our meetings at CNS have been fairly informal. But this time we have a special guest for you. I'll be able to reveal details before it, but I can't at the moment. We're still sorting a few things out. But it will be very nice. I think most of you will enjoy it. And it will be a lovely evening to finish our sort of year with. So I hope you can put that in your diaries and make it to CNS School. All NARC members are welcome. And then the following week, on Tuesday, the 19th of December, we've got our Christmas dinner, which is at the Village Inn in Little Melton. And the booking deadline for that is the 29th of November. So if you should have seen the the application forms and the booking forms for that on the newsletter today that went out, and also one that went out last week. And also there are paper copies at the meeting. So that's next Wednesday's meeting at the 29th. There's the form there. Not that you could do much with it here on television, but you please download it, or you can print one. You can pick up a printed copy next Wednesday and fill it in. We've got about 2/3 roughly of the seats are now sold, and we can only take 72 people. So there's two things to look forward to this Christmas. Now on to members' news from you. We haven't had too much actually, but a couple of interesting things. Firstly, from Bob G6PWS, he says, I always attend Ypres. I've looked up the pronunciation of that for their remembrance service to go on to visit my grandfather at Kemmel Chateau. He took a few pictures, but this one stood out for him after we visited the trenches of death near Dixmude. I hope I've pronounced that right. That's a mass French graveyard along the road. That is a stunning picture. And Bob sent that just after Remembrance Day. Thank you, Bob. And from Martin G7UGB, Hi David and Tammy, we all know that the cost of living has gone mad this last year, and also the cost of magazines. Practical Wireless, for example, is now £5.99 per issue, which is a lot. I don't know if you or the club members know, but you can get a huge selection of magazines, including Practical Wireless, for free by signing up to Norfolk County Library Service with your current library card. The app concerned is called Press Reader, and once installed and tethered to your NCC library card, you need a PIN number from the library which they give you on request, you can then read and download your magazine of choice. I download my choice as to my tablet, but you can use a PC with a larger screen if you want to. The choice is huge, and across the world titles are available, but it has Practical Wireless and a good range of computer titles, and also all the BBC magazine titles, gardening, cooking, etc., as well as the national daily papers. Just thought it might save people a bit of money when things are getting tight. And Martin's also offered to give folks a hand if they want to know more. So thanks very much for that really useful tip, Martin. And finally from you, Simon M0SAH sent us this picture, which is a romantic cushion for the geek in your life.
You know what you're getting for Christmas then.
Thanks, Tammy. So roses are FF0000. I think it's to do with hexadecimal, but because I'm not a geek, I wouldn't know. But anyway, I love that. Thanks very much, Simon. So Tammy, over to you with your little people. I hope your technology's working now.
Yep, technology's working, yep. Here's the little people for this week. So, have you ever wondered what has happened to all the old telephones?
Ah, yes. So they're in the groove sort of thing.
They're being modernised by...
Well, I don't know. Yeah, well, they are, because, of course, records are all back in favour. I don't know. Actually, do discos now use records? I know records are back in favour with the buying public, but are DJs using records now?
I'm not sure.
Or are they still scratching and all that stuff?
Have you been to a nightclub recently?
I have. Is that a trap question from a wife? No, I haven't been to a nightclub. Actually, I have, haven't I?
Yeah,
we did
a
few couple of months ago, but no, they didn't use records, I can assure you. All those records I used to cart around in little drinks. You know the little bottle of Britvic type mixers? Those boxes, wooden boxes, any of you of my sort of era in the 80s would remember those. And those boxes were perfect for storing 45 singles, and you could stack them. Schweppes bottles, that sort of thing.
Right. Okay.
Before your time. Anyway, miniature-calendar.com is where those pictures come from. Thanks, Tammy. You choose one for us every week. So what have you been doing? So we didn't have too much news from you in the last couple of weeks. We'll be meeting again 2 weeks from tonight, so we love to hear from you. Let us know. Drop us an email to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. If you can get it to us by 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the NARC Live, then we'll be sure to include it. Thank you very much. Now, on to that competition. We asked 2 weeks ago, what on earth is this?
Wow.
And this is one of those ones, well, I won't tell you to the end, actually, what I was going to say, but we had quite a few responses. If you know what that is, by the way, and you haven't already entered, if you're very, very, very quick, you can put it onto BATC and Facebook, and I'll read it to you before we reveal what it is. There are quite a few clues there, and we haven't edited the picture. Anyway, these are the replies. So Mike, GAEY, was first off and says that looks like a theremin to me. Kev, M0KKM, says, I think the latest one on earth is a theremin, an odd electronic instrument you play without touching it to create strange, unworldly sounds. Chris, G3XVL, I think this week's mystery object was a theremin. And he also says, by the way, a great show with the two Bobs and Bob, HB9ASQ. That was our last programme. Martin, G3ZQU, not sure if I've spelt it right, but I reckon it's a pheronome, which I think we know what you mean, a theremin, I think is what you probably mean, Martin. Produces music by moving your hand close to the vertical spike. And then Steve, G0KYA, he was the last person to tell us, and he says, looks like a solid-state Tesla coil, lots of sale from China. Now, has anybody entered anything? No, they haven't. Because we're now about to tell you what it is, and the answer is, it's a Tesla coil toy.
I've actually got two videos here, so
I'll
just put them going. So
I'll just read it to you while you show them. Well, we can play them out as well.
The first one.
Which my son brought me as a surprise for my birthday. This is Bruce, G4KZT. Look at that. You wouldn't want to be touching that to make music. You'd be making the wrong sort of music, I think. Wow. The knobs on the front change the frequency and power of the sparks. That was the video clip 1. He says it can also act as a Bluetooth speaker, sparking in time to the music, or Morse code, as in the second video clip. Well,
bit crazy, isn't it?
It is a bit crazy, and I'm not sure that would put people off doing Morse or encourage them really, because it's a shock. Could have quite a shock. He says, Bruce says, I doubt it will fox all your NARC Live viewers, but you never know. Thank you very much, Bruce. You did actually fox most of them, except for Steve G0KY, so well done to you. By the way, Bruce puts, P.S. you would be very unpopular if you used one of these during a contest. It generates RF from DC to daylight. So a really horrible cover the bands with that. Anyway, thank you very much. That's an interesting one there. So let's have a look at next week's, or this week's, new object. What on earth is this? I reckon this is tricky. I can see our guest having a close look at this as well. Do you know what that is? What it's for? What fits in those clippy things, you know? Can't say too much more really. Can't give it away. It's very, very specific. I happen to know a couple of people I'm watching who've joined. We've got 51 people watching now on NARC Live on BATC, and I know that a couple of those are into something that would make them probably know what that is.
You're not allowed to give clues.
I'm not giving clues. I'm just saying certain interests of a couple of people I noticed I haven't seen for a while. They might know what this is. Anyway, if you know what that is, you know what to do. Drop us an email. In just under 2 weeks' time is the latest you can do it. But if you know now, drop me an email now, radio@dcpmicro.com, and we'll include you in the list of people who can guess what that is, or what it's for, or what it's called, and what fits in those clips. I'll give you half a mark if you can get that. Thank you very much for sending that in. Okay, I will just say now, we are really, genuinely very short of objects now. I think we only have 2 left in the bank, and I've got one of my own, which we might show. So please, if you enjoy doing this competition, and lots of you do, sometimes we have 2 pages of people who've entered, then if you have a look around your kitchen, your workshop, and your box of oddments and things, as long as it's vaguely guessable by somebody what it is, then please send us a picture. Tell us what it is as well with an email, and then we can use it and keep this competition running. It could even be, dare I say, maybe a regular object taken from an unusual angle with a camera, possibly something like that. But that's what this competition's all about. Drop them to radio@dcpmicro.com. There's the address at the bottom of your screen now, and we look forward to getting them so that we can carry on with the competition. So just before we meet our guest, let's just tell you what's happening in the club this week. On Sunday, we've got GB Tourist News on GB3MB at 7 o'clock. On Monday at 7:30, the Monday Night Net on GB3MB. And at 8 o'clock, the 80-metre CW net on 3.543 megahertz. Then next Wednesday, which is November the 29th, we meet at the 6th Form Common Room of CNS, as usual, between 7 and 9:30. It's a social and also an informal Raspberry Pi jam with Jeff. So if you're still putting your Raspberry Pis to good use, you can join us for that. Plus, something else. Donard, M0KRK, some time ago asked us if we had anything in the club to find out where a fault is in his long coax feeder in his garden. He suggested maybe like a time domain reflectometer, which BT used to find faults in traditional copper cables and exactly where they are, pinpointing where the problem is, because his is buried underground. Now we've found out since that, and I mentioned it at a committee meeting we had, that you can use an antenna analyzer or maybe a nano VNA for doing this, as well as a particular, the time domain reflectometer, which is the traditional bit of equipment used. So, can you help? Do you know a way of doing this? Have you got the sort of equipment and skills to come and show us? Because that's what we're also suggesting we do next Wednesday, is bring various bits of equipment in. I've asked a couple of people if they can bring in some of those things. But if you've got a way of detecting where a fault might be in a piece of coax, then come and join along. And if you can't provide the solution, but you're interested to find out how, then we'll also be doing that, of course, next week, not just for Donard, but for anybody else interested. So that's what will be happening next week at CNS. And that's almost it now, just to say, please keep those stories coming, your news. We always love to share that news, pictures, as well. And don't forget, we really would love some more items for What on Earth Is This? But now it's time to meet our guest. Now, Fred, VE1FA, is from Canada, and we've met him before, and he gave us a brilliant talk on the radio aboard the Titanic before, and he's with us again tonight. So it's welcome to Fred. Hello, Fred.
Hello, David. Pleased to be back.
Really good to be back, and we've got a way around those technical gremlins that you had on the Zoom with the screen. So we're going to try and do that in a moment, but we're really looking forward to this talk. I'll just tell everybody at home as well, of course, we welcome your questions and your comments to Fred, so ask them at any time during his talk, and we'll read them to him at the end. And now, Fred, I'm going to hand over to you, and we will bring you questions and comments and things at the end. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. Well, I hope this is interesting to some of your listeners. It's called Air Sea Rescue in World War II and the Gibson Girl Transmitter. And Air Sea Rescue, once the war was really going, became extremely important. And the rationale is perhaps obvious, but I think it's worth stating. That one, simply for morale. In those early stages of the war, I'm thinking mostly, I should say, about the Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force of the U.S., which was the bombers. And in Britain, to the best of my knowledge, the tour of duty was 30 missions. And for the Americans, under the American rules, it was 25 missions. And early in the war, the chances of surviving 30 missions or 25 was far below 50%. So it was a pretty grim outlook for those brave men who went up and manned the bombers at the time. So they said, we have to do something about getting effective air-sea rescues. And one, for morale, for obvious reasons. Two, as the war went on, it became more and more obvious that early in the war, of course, the British had a real problem after Dunkirk, just not having much materiel. But as the war went on and Britain, the US, and Canada produced enormous amounts, it became more and more obvious that the aircrew were far more valuable than the plane they were flying in. So for a very practical reason, you wanted to see as many of those men return as possible. And the third was simply humanitarian. Now, this is sort of a little capsule of what we're going to talk about. And so the ETO, the European Theater of Operations, the 8th Air Force, the U.S. bomber groups, the losses were 55,000 aircrew killed and captured, 8,400 wounded. Under Bomber Command, which includes the Canadians, 38,300 aircrew killed, and Canadians lost 10,000 killed, which in proportion to our population here was a lot. And other allies, the Poles and other brave men who flew in the Lancasters and similar planes, 6,600 were killed. So an enormous loss of life through the course of the war. And this is only for the bombers. It doesn't include the transports, the planes that went out over the western approaches, anything else, or all the fighters. This doesn't include the fighter casualties. But the success rate early in the war, and of course many of these planes shot up over Germany, never made it back to Britain. They ended up in the Channel, the Bay of Biscay, the North Sea, and so forth. And the survival of going into the water, ditching as it was called, was about 12% in 1939 and 40. So if your plane went in, you knew you had a chance of about, well, they didn't know the number then, but a chance about 1 in 8 that you would come out alive. By 1945, it was 90%. So the success went from 12% to 90%. And I'm going to try to talk about how that was done. And at the end, in the European theater, 1,978 aircrew were, at least that's the official number, were rescued from the water. And in the Pacific, this was mostly the U.S. Army and Navy, 1,841 aircrew were rescued. So almost 4,000 men lived another day because of the air-sea rescue that was put together as a very efficient system. Here's just some pictures of some planes that made it back to England. This one's always looks a little bit sad. It's a B-17, one of the U.S. bombers, and probably an 88 shell hit it directly. And the radio operator would have been sitting at his little desk just about where that rip in the metal is, and the right-hand waist gunner would have been standing a few feet away from him in the same thing. And you had the gunner down here. There's a bubble turret that hangs from the bottom of this particular plane, and whether he survived or not is problematic. But this was one that made it back. You can imagine the ones that didn't, what shape they were in. This is another one that just made it back, minor damage, and the bombardier was up here, and when he wasn't aiming the bombs, he was operating this machine gun, swinging in the wind out here. So just to put you in, let's say, in the mood of what these men went through. So back in 1939-41, when the recovery of downed airmen was so poor, it was for fairly obvious reasons, especially at night in fog or foul weather, heavy rain, snow. You'd be unseen when you went in, unheard, and almost 7 times out of 8, never found. And at best, you might last 7 days, and of course, much less in winter. So you sit down, you think about, well, what can we do? How can we improve the situation? Well, you've got 2 questions. How do you know that there are crashed forced landing survivors in the sea? And second, how do you quickly locate them and get to the downed aircrew? The answer is pretty obvious. Downed aircrew announce their survival and their location using some sort of small portable emergency transmitter. And so in the 30s, I suspect that Britain did too, but I found evidence that for sure that the Germans and the Americans both experiment with just exactly this. And of course, we all know that the radios were fairly heavy and fairly power hungry back in those days, especially the transmitters. And so they tried batteries, and it did not work in the end. The batteries were simply too heavy, big heavy lead acid cells for the filaments, and some arrangement of usually dry cells for the B+. And so the battery had too short a life. It would be dead when needed. And another problem was that the planes go from very often high temperatures in the fuselage when they're on the ground in the sun to very low temperatures, far up 30, 40,000 feet. So anyway, batteries did not work. The answer came to a British patrol boat in the Channel in 1941. They saw a little yellow rubber raft of the sort that was used by airmen when their plane went in. It was empty. They could see it in the distance, that it was empty of people. But when they got up to it, it had this yellow contraption in it. And it turned out to be what the Germans called a Notsendat 2. And it was an aluminum box, and it had a crank on top, and which operated a dynamo inside. And it put out about 5 watts on 500 kilohertz, or kilocycles, as they would have said. And it turned out that the Germans devised it, and it was made by Philips in occupied Holland. Hand crank generator, and what you see here, this is an antenna, and what holds that antenna up is a box kite. And it works fairly well when you have the right level of wind, not excessive and not calm. Now, this was the starting point for the Allies. Just to get, again, a little bit ahead of the story, but to give you some idea, the one that the Allies came up with was considerably improved over this. One thing was that this, you had to crank at 120 RPM. That's 2 cranks per second, and it's a very uncomfortable speed for even a healthy young person. And so the Allied one cranks at 80 RPM, and this is sort of a natural speed. You can keep this up without too much trouble. Because it's lower, that means that there is a somewhat greater load, because both the dynamo in this and the dynamo in the newer one have to run at 5,000 RPM. So there's quite a gear train inside. The Allied one in the end was 18 pounds compared to 29, and no leg strap. And this was held, the reason it's got the hourglass shape is it's held between your legs, with the front facing out, and you're cranking this. Now, if the muscles that pull your legs together, when you pull your legs together, they're relatively weak. And a 29-pound metal object, when you're cranking vigorously, the natural inclination is for the whole thing to drop down out of your reach. And it was very difficult to crank. And those little muscles that pull your legs together got exhausted very quickly. So it was a miserable thing to work with. Another problem was that you could only use this system if you had wind at roughly the right speed. If it was calm, you couldn't put your kite up, and no one would hear you even if you cranked. So the British, they came up with a T1333, and they were the first to put the belt on, and this made an enormous difference. So your legs you didn't have to use your own muscles. The belt held your legs in, and they put these little pads on instead of an hourglass box. But the problem was that this is late 1941 when they came up with this, and they simply didn't have the capacity at that time to build as many of these things as they wanted. What factories were working had 100 other things they needed to build for the war effort. And so they came to the U.S. And they used the phrase, as soon as humanly possible, they wanted a replacement for this. And this is the replacement that was developed. And they began work on it. It was built by the Bendix Company of North Hollywood, California. And they were a logical outfit to select because they were building radio direction finding radios of all sorts of direction finding equipment that was put in planes and ships. So they build the direction finders. Why shouldn't they build the device that wants to be found? And they were in mass production by May of 1942. And had a lot of improvements. By the end of the war, 100,000 of them had been produced. They were used in all sorts of planes and boats as emergency radios. And as a matter of fact, even after the war, the one I have has a little aluminum plaque riveted on, and it says, what's it, KLM. And after the war, for a long time, any plane flying overseas would have one or two of these just in case. Okay. Now, Gibson Girl, where did that come from? Well, there was an American fashion designer and artist named Charles Dana Gibson, and he drew these beautiful girls with their wasp waists, which was all the style. And even long after, this is sort of course, 1910, 1900, even long after everybody knew about Gibson girls, and they were beautifully drawn girls with the wasp waist, the hourglass figure, and that's I guess the first sailors and soldiers that saw these things thought of the shapely women, and hence the Gibson Girl transmitter. And there was actually two types produced. The first was called the BC 778, and this was for the European theater, and they built a different one for the Pacific. And the reason was that the BC 778, the main output was 500 kilohertz, and its rated distance was 250 miles in the daytime and 500 miles at night. And for planes going down, in the Bay of Biscay, the English Channel, the western approaches, the North Sea, that was pretty good, 250 miles, because virtually every boat and plane carried a radio of one sort or another, or several radios, that would tune 500 kilohertz, and certainly all the shore stations would. And so that was fine for that scenario, but the Pacific was another story. As you're all aware, it's a very big ocean, and 250, 500 miles wouldn't nearly cover the distances between sunken ships and planes that have gone in to the nearest rescue point. So they had to come up with a way to make the thing audible much further away. And I'll explain in a minute just what they did. So the Gibson Girl, the 778 in the European theater, ended up in virtually all Allied multi-engine planes and many standard ship lifeboats, and also in basically any large plane. And in the end, we'll see towards the end of the war, they had another approach in which they dropped actual boats into downed air crew that were in little rubber rafts, and the actual boats would have water, food, medicine, and a Gibson Girl transmitter strapped to, or bolted to the side of the lifeboat. And they produced about 100,000. There are other ways of getting noticed in the ocean, like sea dye and smoke canisters and signal mirrors, but they're all when the rescue was on this side of your horizon. Things beyond the horizon, you needed a radio, and you needed the Gibson Girl. Here's the two types, the BC778 for the European theater and the CRT3. And quick glance tells you they're pretty much the same, which is not quite the case when you get inside, because this thing, the difference between 500 kilohertz and the initial high frequency was 8280, 8.28 megs, and eventually it went to 8364, 8.364 megahertz. They were both previously used as emergency frequencies. This one was one that was selected by all the services, at least all the American services. So this would, with good propagation, 8.3 megs could be heard 3,000 miles and more. And so that's, and when you cranked the thing, every 30 seconds, it shifted between transmitting on 500 kilohertz and going to 8280 on the first ones, or 8364 kilohertz on the later units. So it was sort of an MF-HF switch every 30 seconds. Fair amount of sophistication for the time. And so you'd alternate back and forth. The early one had just 500, but it had a variety of messages encoded on plastic discs inside, so you could switch over from one message to another. You had quite a choice of different messages. We'll go a little deeper into the thing in a moment. Okay, here's a close look at the controls on the top. Actually, maybe I'll just go back and give you just an intro to the thing. So the front here, you can plug in a signal light, and the signal, you have a choice. It's either or, transmitter or signal light, and I'll explain why. In some cases, one is much more useful than the other. They're both useful. Down here, there's two. This one you can't open, and this just has desiccant to keep the interior of the radio, which of course is all completely waterproof, dry. This one here, you unscrew this little aluminum plug and attach to a 16-foot length of finely woven bronze wire, and you just throw it over the side, and that gives you a 15-foot ground wire in the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. Here, there's a reel of 300 feet of that same fine woven bronze wire inside, and you pull that pin out there, which is on every little thing that might get lost is on a chain or is otherwise secured. I should say, when this thing was built by Bendix in North Hollywood, they were actually very smart about it. They were under a deadline as soon as humanly possible, but they did their best to really test this thing out, because you have to put yourself in the position of, say, aircrew that's just, let's imagine they've just been over Germany, they've had enormous tension, they've been shot to bits by the cannons on the ME-109s or the Focke-Wulfs, or they've been blasted with the accurate anti-aircraft fire, and their plane is dying and they're heading for the ocean, and they're shaken, they may be wounded, they're going to be exhausted, and you're then going to have them in these little soft rubber rafts. This isn't like a big, stout, rigid boat, and they have to be able to put together this radio system that's going to work effectively. So when they were designing this, they first started, they got a big swimming pool somewhere around North Hollywood. I'm sure there was quite a number of them there at the time. And they would throw the kit. The Gibson Girl is you'll see in a moment, it's in a slightly larger bag with a bunch of little things it needs to work. And they'd throw that into the big pool, and then they'd have a guy jump in. And he'd then have to blow up his raft, pull the Gibson Girl kit in, and put the whole thing together. And then they say, well, what was a problem? And they went through it like this, so that every time the fellow who had to do it ran into a problem, they looked at it and said, well, how can we prevent you from losing that piece overboard? Or if your hands are cold and shaky, how can we make this easy? how can we make it easier to put the kite together? And so they did that. And when they got a system which was pretty easy for most of their test candidates to put together in the pool, they did the whole thing in the Pacific Ocean, just offshore. And then they had to, deal with waves and wind and sun and so forth. And so what came out just a few months after the request was put in was a device where they thought of almost every little thing that could go wrong and defeat the use of this. Also, this was a radio that had to be easy to use for a person who had no knowledge of radio. It would be nice if when your plane went in, the radio operator was a survivor and said, let me take over and I'll do it for you. But that often wasn't the case. So they had to come up with something which in most instances could be gotten working by any member of the crew. So here we're looking at the top is the BC 778, the Gibson girl designed for Europe, and a number of things there. First, lots of little things, like you see the lettering up here. Well, all that lettering was luminescent. So if you went in at night, you could still read what it said. Here was the tune. The bronze wire, by the way, was 300 feet long, and then they urged you that if at all possible, use the 300 feet because the radio is designed to optimally load the 300-foot wire. But what they couldn't count on was that your antenna might be straight up, depending on conditions, or it might be just over the surface of the water. And of course, you'd have far more capacitance between antenna and ground if it was close to the water. So they did put in a tune, and over here is a manual key, and in the middle, this switch has the 6 positions. The off's down here, and manual CW are 2 automatic CWs here. And the idea was that we'll start with the radio, and I'll then talk about why you need the light. So you could pick up here. The thing was programmable back at the aerodrome that you started from. The mechanic could go inside and he could switch some wires around and give you a selection of different automatic signals. But this isn't something you would do out on the life raft. So they had them here. So auto 1, and you'd look up at auto 1, and actually you probably can't read it, but auto 1 is on this particular radio, SOS and long dash repeating. And auto 2 is AA, that's da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, fused A's, and long path repeating. And hand keying was another. And for the signal lamp, continuous or hand keying the signal lamp. But when you got down to the CRT3, which essentially had 2 transmitters inside, one for 8.3 megs, one for 500 kilohertz, they sacrificed this diversity of options there. And so what you really had was you put the switch in this position, and you got 500 kilohertz for KC, manual. And here you got 30 seconds of 500, followed by 30 seconds of 8364. And down here, you could use the signal light. Up here, you see it has radio. Down here, everything is off, so no light. So you just swing the light up, and you have the options up here if you just bring the switch up that way. Okay, so the outputs available for the European model, the 778, you could get continuous tone. Why would you want that? Well, of course, what you wanted was a plane or ship to be direction finding on you. And if you've ever tried to direction find on a CW signal, it's very difficult because you're listening, and ideally you have a signal strength meter in front of you if you're direction finding. And the CW, of course, means the direction, the meter's going to be jumping all over the place. It's measuring the amplitude of the received signal. And it's very hard to direction find when your needle's jumping all over the place. So the continuous tone, it makes it much, much easier. The long dashes, well, this is, they had a device at the time which was very useful that with the sinking of the Titanic, it was became law that ships had to have 24-hour monitoring of their radio system. This is larger ships above a given size. but you can't sit there listening on 500 kilohertz for hours and hours and hours with nothing coming through but static. You can, but it's not very productive, and you're likely to be going to sleep at various times. So they came up with an auto alarm, and what the auto alarm is, we'll get into a little bit more later, is it's at least 4 or 5 4-second dashes with 1-second gaps in between. And they had a little mechanism which would, so you'd have a purpose-built 500 kilohertz receiver with the auto alarm detector built in. And this would be connected to lights or bells or a horn or whatever, so that the operator might be sleeping, he might be in the next cabin, but if this series of 4-second with 1-second gaps came through, then this would go off. And so this was, of course, ASR and many bases on shore had this going. Ships had it. Basically, all ships would have an auto alarm sensitive 500 kilohertz receiver, and search planes would have the same. So this was a very effective thing. SOS, for obvious reasons. AA Pro sign. I'm tempted to see. I'm sure there's a number of proficient CW operators listening now, and I'm tempted to say, what does AA Pro sign? That it should be written with a dash or a bar over the A's. I didn't do that, but so it's not da da, it's da 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 da. And what does that mean? I'll mention it in a minute. And a mix in the automatics, you can mix any of these, and of course manual keying. Now I've got a BC778 here. If we were all in a room together, I would set it up. I've got an old BC348, which is the common multi-engine aircraft receiver used in the Second World War, at least by Americans and Canadians. And I've got a 778, and it's kind of amazing. The things were so well built and so sturdy that almost everyone you come across, unless it's been badly fixed by somebody, it'll work. And in mine, first time I tried it, I turned that crank, it got it up to speed, and it started sending SOS. And also da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so let's see. Okay, and yeah, so manual key. But if you're trying to manual key, you've got this thing strapped between your legs, and you're turning it at the 80 RPM, and even with the straps firmly around your legs, it's still moving and squirming and trying to go down. And you're looking around, you're bringing your hand around the front of the thing, and you're trying to you're operating a button that you can't see, trying to send Morse code while you're cranking vigorously with the other hand, and the thing is jumping and jiggling around in your lap. And I would challenge anybody to send really nice code, but of course you weren't worried about nice code. You were worried about getting out something about your position or about who you were. Okay, let's go on. Now here's this is from something called the ROIF, restricted. And this is the World War II. This was part of the ongoing education of the American and Canadian aircrew, and I suspect the British had something similar. And so we went there, and ROIF is Radio Operators Information Folder. And you can see it was in a ring binder type folder, and you were issued one when you became part of the crew. And periodically, every few months or sooner, as was required, you'd get a packet of information. This is each individual air crew. And if you were a waist gunner, you got one package of information. If you were the radio op, you got a different one. If you were the navigator or the bombardier, you got your custom packages. And you'd snap open your ring binder and it would say, throw away pages 16 to 22, which you would do, and then you'd put in the latest information. And it had the technical upgrades, operating tricks, and anyway, and any information which would be make you a more effective crew member or keep you alive for longer would go in there. And so this is just a list of the pro signs which were in use. This was revised March 1945, towards the end of the war. You know, again, Radio Officers Information Folder. And sure enough, here AA is unknown station. Now, why would it be important to have unknown station as something you would send out when you were in a little rubber raft out in the middle of the North Sea? And the reason was that every other radio transmitter, every station, whether it be in a boat or a big ship or a tank or a truck or on land or an aircraft, had some kind of call sign. And so if you heard da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, that was a Gibson girl. And so didn't tell you where it was, didn't tell you who was operating it, but at least it was an emergency call just as much as SOS was. But if it was the da-da-da-da, then you could be quite sure it was a Gibson girl. Here's the Russians often imitate, and here's the Russian version of a BC 778. It came out, I think, a year after the Allied, well, they were allies too, after the American one came out. And I think it did have a big knob on its wire reel there that's missing from this one. But anyway, you can see the similarity. Now this is the top. If you're sitting there with this machine between your legs, you're all strapped in place. And as I was said earlier, it's designed for use by people who know nothing about radio. So if you read what's on the front here, you know just how to operate it. Like Morse code, if you want to try your hand at manual, how to use a signal lamp separate to operate radio transmitter, and actually I can almost read it off here. Install crank, set pointer to, so this was for a CRT3, so you're pointed to the shared 83, 64, and 500, the automatic position. Raise full length of antenna by kite or balloon, strap unit between legs, see figure up here, crank just fast enough to keep speed indicator lighted, keep cranking, keep indicator lighted. Now, these two things up here, this is where you put the crank. And as you get it, I should say that the whole kit or the Gibson Girl by itself make good life preservers. So, because they're completely waterproof and they're quite buoyant. And you can actually use those straps or to go around your leg to strap it, say, around your shoulders to keep your head up if you're out in the water. Anyway, so you sit down, you undo that. It says turn, crank socket, remove. You take this off, you put the crank in, you screw it down, and you start cranking. And it's set up so that there's a standard little number 47 bulb under here, the little 7 millimeter brass socketed bulbs that have been used forever for indicator lights and behind your frequency readout on old radios. And so you've got that in there. You start cranking, and at first the cranking is quite light because the dynamo, of course, produces about 6 volts for the filaments of the two tubes and about 330 volts for the plate. And you start cranking, it's quite light, but then you get up to a certain speed and all of a sudden this light lights. And because what's happened is at a certain RPM, when you're up to the point where the voltages are high enough to operate the radio properly, then a voltage sensitive relay kicks in and you're connected to the tubes, the transmitter's ready to work as soon as it warms up, and a little light comes on there. So as you're cranking, you know you're at the right speed. Now, if you get all excited and decide, well, maybe the radio will send further if I crank faster, that doesn't work because they put a little a governor in there. Classic governor with 2 little spring-loaded arms which swing out and drag against a metal cylinder if you go too fast. So it's actually, you don't need to read any instructions. Just start cranking, and once you see that light lit, just keep going at that speed. If you try to go faster, it'll force you to slow down. So it's quite intuitive. It's quite nice to use. I should mention I have one of these, and I would put on a demonstration, but I don't think I could really do it in this room. But I've given this talk several times before, and I've got a BC348, the classic receiver for it, and they work fine. Anyway, in this one here, this has a neon bulb with a fairly large current limiting resistor in series with it, connected directly to the antenna line leaving the box. So let's say you're sending SOS, you're cranking there. The light over here has been lit for it takes about 15 to 20 seconds for the tubes to start functioning. And when you do, you look in here and you see that bright orange neon glow when RF is passing through the wire and out of the box. And so it's very encouraging if you're out there in the middle of the ocean and you're hoping the thing works. When you look into the right-hand little aperture there, the little window, you're looking at an Ne2 bulb, and it's beating it's flashing SOS. And if it's flashing SOS, you know that RF is going out of the box, unless you don't have the little wire from the box to the antenna connected. So it's kind of a morale booster, and you can see that there's nothing wrong with the whole system that is working. If you don't have an antenna attached, you don't get much light because you don't get much RF current, of course. Here's another ROIF page. I just put this in, one, to show how they expect you to look when it's all hooked together. There's some wires down here. You can't really operate the kite while you're transmitting. So it assumes you're by yourself. If there's a second person here, it all becomes a bit easier. And you can switch off on the cranking, of course. So the load of the box kite is taken by there's a little tab on each of the life rafts there. And you just run some non-conductive cord. Everything is all set. You just clip it together. So you have a wire bearing the current out of the radio and up to the antenna. And below that, there's an insulated line taking the strain at the oar lock. And you've got the little plugs taken out and thrown over the side, and it weights down that 15 feet of wire for your ground. And here's a note for those of you that might be interested in 630 meters, because remember, this is a radio that went through a good deal of engineering to be as efficient as possible at 600 meters, not much different from 630. Anyway, what you can expect at sea, 250 to 500 miles range. In a freshwater lake, 50 to 150 miles. On the edge of a lake or stream, 30 to 50 miles. On land, grounded moist earth, 5 to 10 miles. So the reality is that the ground is exceedingly important in a system like this at 500 kilohertz, 600 meters. Here's the whole kit called the SCR 578. By the way, the way the US labeled things, BC usually means basic component. And what that means in proper English is that it's the core of the system. So that'll be, you might have a radio that's BC something or other, and then there's all these other names for its accessories. So this is how the thing looks. That hook, normally that's hooked by the most likely egress from the plane or the ship, if it's on a ship. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah. So this is not a military setting, as you might guess, but it does show all the parts of the kit. And the kite, obviously. I have one of these. They're a natural flyer. They're a very nice kite. The radio itself. Now, I haven't mentioned it yet, but one of the fundamental problems, what do you do in calm weather? With the German system, you didn't transmit. In this system, you have two chances to put up a hydrogen-filled balloon. And these little cans here, if you see two little orange cans next to the whole kit, those have neoprene balloons in them, and they were filled with nitrogen. The can was flushed with nitrogen and then sealed. And it's the old system, which I presume you have in the United Kingdom. Cans would have a key fastened to the lid, and you could lift the key, break it off, and there'd be a little tongue along the side. You put the tongue through the slot in the key, and you turn it, and you basically take the lid off the can. So it's an airtight sealed system there. And these big gray cylinders, these are the hydrogen generators. And these two rods here, everything is in duplicate in case you make a mess with your first try. As a matter of fact, they get two extra rolls of antenna wire, 300 feet, as well as the roll that's on it. So you can make a variety of mistakes and still continue and still get a balloon up. This gadget is a wrench for taking off all the large plastic things you need to take off to insert the crank and to open the door here. And the door has a brake in it because it's also a kite reel, and this will work on that. An average person with dry hands doesn't need this, but they're thinking, well, some of the people that maybe want to use this have just been in the salt water for hours and their hands are all soft, or they've got wounds, or a number of other reasons why they're not going to try to take off a tightly stuck nut. There's the light is in here. We'll get to that in a moment, but this is the whole system. Here's just the kite. There's a couple of things. One, you see all this writing here. We won't go through it. It explains how to put the kite together, which after you've done it takes about 20 seconds. And what it is in the middle, you can just pull a kite into two pieces, but the strains on it are such that it won't come apart when it's flying. There's these crosses on both sides. You push that down, and the whole thing collapses, and it ends up fitting in this little bag here. And this is true of almost all this stuff. If you look at each of these cans or everything else, it has the instructions pertinent on the items, so that you don't say, where'd you put the instruction manual? There is an instruction manual with it, but you really don't need to use it if you just look at the parts and what each part says. I even have here that it flies best at low wind speeds, 7 to 20 miles an hour, if you use the lower loop on the one corner of the kite, and 15 to 40 miles an hour if you use the loop up in the corner of the top of the kite. So it's and interesting, they have swivels, and for swivels they used the standard fishing swivels that many of you will be familiar with. Anyway, everything, I love the design. Everything is designed to work and designed for people who sometimes make mistakes. And if you make a mess of the first balloon and the hydrogen generator, you've got another to work with. Here's some of them. Some of these kits have a parachute on top. And if you stop and think for a moment, at first you say, well, that seems kind of stupid, because when your wounded plane is coming in, the pilot is doing his best to land it on the water with the tail down a bit and the nose up. I mean, if you plunge into the water, you and the plane are headed for the bottom very quickly. So he does his best. So he's skimming just over the water, trying to get the plane in the perfect position to settle down. So if you get all panicky and you throw out the radio with the parachute, it'll open, of course, but by the time the plane is stopped, you may be several miles from where the transmitter landed in the water, and you're never going to get to it. What it's for is they made the parachute model for those that were carried as spares in rescue planes and search planes. So if the search plane found a life raft or a ship's lifeboat with stranded crew, that didn't have a radio, then they would drop this as close as they could to the boat or to the life raft. So this was in the cases where the castaways didn't have a Gibson girl. They dropped them on. And here, of course, is the static line. You put that big clip on a wire by the door of the plane. You throw it over. When the static line pays out, these two little pins just pop out and on the flap, and then the flap pops open, and out comes the chute. But again, this was just for people. Remember, most of the rescue planes, the search planes, couldn't land on the water. Only if you had a PBY Catalina or one of the amphibious planes could you land. So the common occurrence was that the airmen in the water were found by a plane that couldn't rescue them, and ideally they would send, of course, the information back to base, but they could give a location, a latitude and longitude for where they found the people in the raft. But if it took till the next day to get an amphibious plane out there, they could be 100 miles away from the original location. And so this, having the radio, even after you were first spotted, could be very important. Here's just again from the ROIF. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's sort of interesting. Here's if you're near somebody who's in trouble, then this is the chute coming out and the Gibson girl. What you were supposed to do with the one on your plane when it went in was get the lifeboat out first. Obvious rationale for that. And then you use a static line. You give one of the guys in the lifeboat one end of the static line. You just throw the Gibson girl in the water and then concentrate on getting the people and any food and water you have into the life raft. And once that's all squared away, you could just pull in the Gibson girl and start to set it up. This here, it's just talking about what is the radio operator's, what he should do when the captain announces that they're ditching. And what he's doing, there was a system called IFF, Information Friend Foe, and they switch the IFF on. They ask the navigator for their exact position. If possible, they send their exact position a few times, depending on the time available. Then they screw down the key to leave a steady note, and they abandon the plane. Here's a guy who doesn't look like he's been through a day of bombing and getting shot to bits and swimming in the sea. But anyway, he's hooking up the, this is from a training manual, hooking up the wire to the kite. This is more like the reality of how you would be. As I said, much better if there's two people there, especially if you want to use the CW. Let the guy who doesn't know CW crank, and then you can send your specific message. Here's the can with the balloon in it. And again, all instructions you need in using that special pipe. You had to be very careful because the chemistry was a calcium hydride plus water. Seawater is fine. You get calcium hydroxide, which is very close to lye, a very caustic, strong alkali, plus hydrogen gas, plus heat. The thing gets very hot. So you put the generator down in the sea beside you and to keep it cool. And even the gas is so hot coming off that this is an insulated piece or bakelite slid over the aluminum tube. And this fitting, it fits very tightly on the bottom of the balloon. And as the balloon is filling, you connect the little fishing swivel and the bronze wire. And this is all, you just open the door of the transmitter, the little door with the kite reel inside, and pull out a few feet, clip it on to a little device which is already on the base of the balloon, and hold this all together, water level down here, and then the generator, and the one generator gives one correct fill. And here's, they've got it out, and they would now be paying out the wire because this will now be 300 feet above the boat, and they'll be carefully paying out the wire using the brake and the reel in the transmitter. Here's the lights, and the first time I saw the picture, it looked pretty silly. This guy, this flight crew, with this thing on top of his head, it looked like kind of a joke, but there was it was very important. Two reasons. One, initially, especially if you went in at night, and of course, as I'm sure you all know, the British bombed primarily at night for a large part of the war. So when the planes went in, it was pitch black. And in the pitch black, of course, there's confusion, especially the B-17 had 10 crew. I'm not sure about the Lancaster, but it must have had at least 6 or 7 crew to fulfill all the things that needed to be done. When the plane went in, there'd be all sorts of confusion. And usually with a crew of 10, for instance, there was multiple life rafts. And so people got separated in the water, the life rafts got separated, maybe a floating box with food or water in it got separated. And you couldn't find anything. And shouting in the open sea, it's very difficult to determine the direction. So if some crew member is floating off in his Mae West, you can't tell where he is. So the light at the beginning was extremely useful, and it was very simple because all you had to do was you didn't have to set up the antenna or the ground or anything. You just haul the Gibson girl out of the bag, grab the little light, plug it in, and start cranking. And make sure the switch is in the on the front is in the light position. And you've got a fairly powerful light. And so you can find your friends, you can get organized, don't lose anything precious in the confusion. The other use was straight up. And the way the system was supposed to work, and did work most of the time, was that you'd be out there and it'd be quiet, maybe some wind and waves, of course, but you'd be listening for the drone of a plane as you cranked your Gibson girl in the radio mode, and you start hearing a drone. I suppose, I'm sure that a lot of these aircrew could tell the drone of a Lancaster or a B-17 from the drone of one of the German planes, a Heinkel or whatever. And I suppose if you heard it was a German plane, you just kept the light off. But if it was an Allied rescue plane, then what you would do is you would keep sending your SOS or whatever you were sending with the on the radio until they got fairly close. You'd be listening to the drone of the engine. When it got what you would estimate a few miles away, you'd stop, you'd throw the switch and put it over to the light, because you can't DF right on top of where the signal's coming from. So the direction finding becomes useless. And then the rescue craft wants lights, wants to be able to find you. So you put that on, and you might think that a little bulb, which is similar to the ones that light the dial on your old radio, what use is that in the middle of the sea? But the rescue planes, the search planes rather, were typically at a height of 2,000 to 3,000 feet. And assuming there weren't clouds between the plane and the surface of the sea, a little light like that is perfectly visible. We used to go out to CY9, Charlie Yankee 9, St. Paul Island, and the beautiful old lighthouse has been replaced by these cheesy little fiberglass cylinders, which had they had a brake light bulb basically in them to power them, in a solar panel and a storage battery, of course. Anyway, the brake light bulb could be seen for up to 20 miles away on the surface of the ocean at night. And so the little flashlight bulb is plenty for a plane at 2,000 or 2,500 feet, if it's clear, looking down. They'll see that light. And so it's essential in being found when the rescue plane is close. And even if they can't rescue you, they can get your coordinates and radio those back. Okay, okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Okay, we already, perfectly well. There's no batteries to worry about. I think of them as Armstrong generators. I should say that these machines are 80 years old, and they still almost always work, just turning the crank and they generate power. So they put out 28 volts at 0.2 amps. So there's two 12-volt filament tubes in series, and 330 volts, which is what the plate of it's a 12A6. It's a little beam pentode type tube. Beam tetrode, I should really call it. So the final tube, the 12A6, is taking 330 volts at 40 milliamps and turning it into heat and about 5 watts out. And so the 778, like the CRT3, has this nice ergonomic shape and a wide leg belt. That system works really well. And it's got the overspeed regulator and the underspeed cutout. So it tells you what the proper cranking speed is. And the two tubes are a 12SC7 and the 12A6. And it's also, they make it an electron coupled oscillator, meaning that the screen grid is acting as the plate, and so that the actual plate is only coupled by the flow of electrons. And what this does is it makes it much more stable. In other words, if you run an oscillator to an antenna, the antenna becomes part of the frequency determining system. But if it's an electron coupled oscillator, then that's not the case. There's much, much lower real coupling between the oscillator and the output power. Interestingly enough, they don't have a crystal, because they decide that, if the thing gets slammed against the floor of the plane, or anyway, there's all kinds of rough handling that might occur, the crystal might shatter, especially 500 kilohertz, where you have a big crystal. It's often pretty fragile. So they do it with just an LC circuit, but they're very stable. And mine, which is 1942, it's within less than a kilohertz away from 500 kilohertz exactly. Okay, 5 watts out. It's actually sitting there soaked with salt water. Don't grab onto the antenna because it's about 500 volts peak to peak, because the output impedance is around 10,000 ohms. If you work out the 300 feet, and it's 0.15 wavelength vertical, although, as I said, it's often nearly horizontal. Here's a schematic. I'm not going to analyze it and so forth, but just to point out a few interesting things. You see this series of numbers here. That's a standard Jones plug, 6-pin Jones plug. And so you open the radio by taking the front off. You just pull that plug, and the front panel has all the radio in it on a little circuit board there. And remaining in the case is this down here, which is the generator, the code generator, and basically the cutout relay, and so forth. And most of it is very easy to service. It's very nicely designed. Here's the guts of the one I have at the moment, and I'll just point out a few things. Here's the output tuning. They gold plated the capacitor, so that because once these things corrode, their efficiency goes down substantially. And here's the frequency determining coil, all sealed in some I don't know, I hadn't encountered this before, but some very, very tough, not quite as hard as ceramic, but very tough material over the coil. And all the capacitors are micas, which is quite nice. You don't have those old waxy paper affairs to replace. So there's nothing that needs to be done to most of these things, unless they've been badly played with. They just work. The two tubes are in just humble Bakelite sockets, little springs on top so they can't pop out of their mounts. Here's this is the desiccant. There's one of the little screw caps on the front you can't take off as a occupant of the life raft, and that's just desiccant to keep the insides dry. There is the back of the light plug, and anyway, that's all we need to see there. But it's all nicely built and easy. You can see very easy. You can replace anything there very quickly. And over here, this is where the ground goes in. And this little cast cylinder is filled with the bronze grounding wire. Here's the other half in the 778, and the dynamo, the cutout relay. Here's the 3 different sets of coded messages under these 3 sets of little contacts. So it's just a cast Bakelite with little bumps for SOS and AA and the auto alarm. Down here is the computer, and you have these 4 numbers, and this is 5, 6, 7, 8. Actually, I think if we look at the next one, yeah, here you go. Here's the numbers, and so the screws underneath are 1 through 4. These are 5 through 8. You just look at a little chart in the manual, and if you choose the order and selection of the messages you want sent in a 1-minute transmission, and then of course the transmission repeats itself. Actually, I should say here that this is the gearbox up here, bringing your 80 RPM to 5,000 RPM in this. It also produces 1 RPM a minute in the code disk, and here's the little governor that keeps your speed down. Up here is the RF monitor, the little neon just out of the picture, and here's the little light which tells you that the generator is generating. It's actually in series with this other bulb, and they also function as a field regulator to keep your voltage stable in the dynamo. Here's the CRT3. It's a little bit different. It only has a single code wheel because you don't have much choice there. The other parts are quite similar. I don't have the transmitter part of the CRT3, but it's quite different, of course, because you've got 2 separate transmitters which share common tubes and basically one's producing 8.3 megahertz and the other's producing 500 kilohertz. So a lot of parts can't be shared. Now, the other way to look at this is it's not just having a well-designed rescue transmitter. You want to make it more effective in any way you can. And so this was developed. And this is a radio room clock. You've probably all seen them at one place or another. And everybody knows, or most people know, that the red wedges are the silent periods. And so you could be busy, but for those periods, you should not be transmitting anywhere near 500 kilohertz. You should be listening, or you should have an auto alarm that's listening. So this gives the guy in the dinghy in the life raft a couple of things. One, he can rest. I mean, you can't crank that transmitter for an hour. At least nobody in the right mind would try. And of course, as time goes by, if you're not rescued, you're getting thirstier and hungrier and in poorer shape. So you concentrate. Most air crew wear a watch. And so hopefully at least one person in your raft has a watch. And so you just have to crank for the 3 minutes, from 15 to 18 in the hour, and from 45 to 48 in the hour. And that's when people will be listening, and that's when you should do it. After the war, this other one, the 2183, a new marine emergency frequency came in, and this, of course, was not for use by cranked transmitters. This is for use by fishing boats and so forth. This is a German version of this, and if you don't see any difference, that's because there isn't any difference other than the language there. You'll notice the dashes around the outside. This is the auto alarm, because you may want to contact an auto alarm, which you certainly do in a life raft, but you don't have one there, or you don't have any way to. So this is where you use the manual key. You watch the second hand or listen. Well, if you're in the life raft, look at your watch. You watch the second hand, and you use the manual key. And so you key 4 seconds, 1 second up, 4 seconds, 1 second up, and so on. This and in boats, if you're sinking, you can use this if your watch isn't working. Anyway, it allows you to generate the signal, which will cause the auto alarm to work. This is a semi-official little insignia that I'm pretty sure both Americans, I know Americans use them and Canadians, but I think perhaps the British did too. I'm not sure. But if you go in, if you're in a ditched plane and you're swimming around and getting wet and cold and are rescued, then you can wear this. Actually, for the U.S., you could wear it on your Class A, your dress uniform, and wear it on your shoulder. And apparently, it was a great conversation opener. If you went into a pub and you saw somebody else with a goldfish on their shoulder, you get always start up a conversation by telling your stories. Here's some of the rescue methods that were used. The Germans actually used an old, well, I don't know if it was old. I think it probably wasn't, a Heinkel biplane, pontoon plane. And the biplanes, of course, have the great advantage that they have a very low stall speed. So they can come in very low and very slow and stop very close to the downed airman. They're all white with a black cross on the side. The RAF had a variety of high-speed launches, and they would send them out. One of the dangers was that if a bomber went in, say fairly close to, say, Holland or the German side of the water, you didn't want to waste time getting in and out, because Germans would often use it as a way, a cat and mouse thing. They'd claim to be just over the horizon from where they knew there was a life raft, and as soon as they saw or heard an Allied ship come in, or a PBY Catalina like this below, they would come over the horizon. And there was one tragic case where there was one man in the life raft, and they sent a PBY out to pick him up, and the Germans came over the horizon, basically destroyed the PBY, so it didn't sink, but it couldn't fly, and killed a number of the crew. And then another PBY came, and it got the same treatment. So you wanted to get in and out as quickly as you could. This is close to the end of the war. In the Pacific, again, because of the great distances, the B-29s were used as rescue planes, and this was, of course, it's a much bigger plane than the B-17 or the Lancaster, and it had a very great range, and so they would put a boat on the bottom, and when they got to the right place, if the castaways, the guys in the lifeboat, were in bad shape, they just dropped them with this boat, and the boat would have water and food and first aid, and a Gibson girl bolted inside, and so this would allow the guys to survive much longer, and it would give time for either an amphibious plane or a ship to get to them. This is a British plane. I'm sorry, I don't know what it is, but what type it is. But here's the boat, and here's the boat released, coming down on 3 parachutes, and two aircrew out from presumably treading water or being in a tiny rubber raft together to a nice afternoon of sailing. And these these British boats, one with the sails was very nice because very often they weren't that far from Britain, 50 miles or something, and they could get themselves home from here. The other thing is that they in these boats they often had a little 3-tube receiver, and 3-tube regenerative receiver, and most of those little regeneratives had 1-volt filaments, so you could have a very modest set of batteries that would run this little thing, and so they could both transmit and receive. Here's the same thing on the B-17, and this would be during the war. This one's still armed. You can see the machine gun turrets, the ball turret, and the upper turret, and can't see the back. But with the plane strapped, the boat strapped to the bottom, and this in the end, because of the fact that they didn't have that many planes that could land on the water, this became very popular. And I mean, to rescue the crew at the cost of a boat was like this was a bargain. And by the end of the war, the ASR had gone to something like this. And here's the B-17. All the armaments are gone. It's painted up in the ASR colors, and it's got the boat underneath. And they had, I want to mention this. This, of course, is a direction-finding loop. And for those of you not familiar with them, you get maximum signal received or transmitted off the broadside, and you get a sharp null when the 2 sides of the loop are aligned with the source of the transmission. That is, if you were looking along it, you just see 1 bar with the 2 sides pointed at the source of the transmission. This worked with it. You can't see it, but between the danger and the little front up there on the loop, it turns. The bottom part's fastened either to the top of the fuselage or the bottom of the fuselage of a plane, or the roof of a boat, ship of some sort. This was what it would go to. The dial is 360 degrees, and so and this was a crank. And here you had a flexible shaft, the same thing that was used for driving speedometers in cars for generations. This would go into the base of the loop. This little crank would allow you to turn the loop, and the gauge up here would follow it. So imagine you're in a plane, you're on a particular course. Then if you were operating the direction finder, you'd report to the cabin that to the captain that the signal that you were trying to direction find was 60 degrees from the bearing that the plane was on, and so the captain would swing at 60 degrees, and he'd be on, and you could double check for him that he was directly on it. Now, this was used, this is what quite modest planes could use to get bearings on people going in. This is what's called a command set, and 1.8 million of them were produced in the U.S. during the war. And typically virtually every plane had a set of 5 of these. 3 receivers. This is the navigational receiver, 190 to 550 kilohertz. And then a 3 to 6 and a 6 to 9 megahertz for communications. And most of them just had the one antenna terminal here. But this one, if you can see, below the one antenna terminal is 2 L's, and that's for loop. And then there's a little switch down here, so you can switch from antenna to loop. This could be in a fighter, a trainer, quite a small plane. They all had this navigation because this was used to find airports and so forth. Every plane required. And so you could switch over to loop, and you'd use that little crank and the little loop I just showed. And so just a warp plane out for practice, or a trainer could, if they picked up something or asked to look for a signal on 500 kilohertz, they could do it, and they could get a reasonable rough bearing. So this, they can't have a massive system. It wouldn't fit in the plane, but this little system here, they had the nav receiver anyway, and so they just fitted out some of the Navy ones. Most of the Army ones didn't have this, but you could just put a little loop on any of them. Just quickly, this is what direction finding would use in most of the planes that went out. Interestingly enough, the company that made all this was Bendix, the same company that made the Gibson girl. And so I suspect that's one reason it was chosen, because they knew all about direction finding and so forth. Anyway, this is basically the master. This is a great big box, weighs about 50 or 60 pounds, completely unsuitable for a small fighter, but in a bomber or a transport or something, it was fine. And they always used this speedometer cable because it allowed them to configure the radio for any plane that they might want to put it in. So this was just tucked away somewhere where it wouldn't get tripped over and wasn't in the way. And then they'd run a flexible cable up, runs the tuning, and this thing, you probably can't read it, but it has off compass. This could be a radio compass, receive antenna, and loop. And so you direction find with this, and you'd have a panel. This is what the sort of thing that was in many planes for that purpose. This was the heart of it. This is the same device as here. Up here is your signal strength needle, and here is the 360-degree device where you turn this crank to turn the loop, and you get a precision bearing off this. And when you're on the target, because this little meter here, the needle takes a big dip. You've nulled it out when it's lined up properly. Okay, this is a couple of last slides. Here's a couple of little stories. This is in the Pacific. A transport was taking a load of these 4 men as crew. It was taking a load of radar equipment from one little island in the Philippines to another little island in the Philippines. And they encountered a violent thunderstorm about halfway to their destination. The pilot couldn't go over it, couldn't go under it, so he went around it, and it was a long way around. By the time they got around the thunderstorm, between the crackling and crashing of the storm and the distance, they could find no directional beacon, and all he had was dead reckoning. He tried that, but they ran out of fuel, and they went in. Fortunately, it was a calm ocean, so they got out, got their Gibson girl into the raft, and everybody got in, I think even with dry feet. The plane went down. They were out there for about 4 or 5 days. They started cranking right away, and they were heard about 600 miles away by a ship. Of course, they didn't know that. And the ship was actually a brand new ship called the Hope. It was a hospital ship which was going from the U.S. on its maiden voyage to the Philippines to pick up wounded from the battles on the Philippines. And anyway, so these guys cranked away for the 4 days, and they on the second day it was very rough, and so they all were seasick, and they lost whatever food and water they had in their stomachs. And so by the 4th day, even though the sea was calm, they were in quite tough shape. They were all badly desiccated and so forth. Anyway, ship came over the horizon, and it headed right for them, and it was the Hope. The Hope would have passed quite close to where they were if it hadn't been for the radio, but it would have been beyond the horizon, so it wouldn't have mattered. They wouldn't have been seen. So they could definitely ascribe their being alive to having the Gibson girl. Here's a jolly looking crew. I think, I don't know if this was before or after. This was a B-29 crew out in the Pacific, and they developed engine trouble way out. And so they looked around and they finally found a little island that they could land on. It was uninhabited and there was no runway, but they managed to more or less land on the beach with the plane halfway in the water. And so they actually operated the Gibson girl from land, but with the ground running out into the water, and they got rescued in the same way. Here's another little one. Somebody took just when a rescue boat got close to a raft, and you can see there's a Gibson girl with a crank, and this guy's looks relieved, so he doesn't have to crank anymore. And this guy's, I guess, pulling in, whether it's the kite or the balloon, I don't know, but one or the other. Anyway, made their day. And this is an ASR building. Maybe it had some other functions too, used by the U.S. during the war, and they're proud of what they do. So they have AAF Emergency Rescue Squadron, and it's not American Air Force, as you may know. It's Army Air Force, because the U.S. never had an independent Air Force till the 50s. Anyway, so they have lives saved, and he's got a big gauge here, and he's setting this to 262, as is the fellow up on top. So this station was coordinated and presumably provided the equipment for 262 men being rescued. And actually, you can't see the painting down here, but it's got there's an amphibious plane, and there's people being rescued. And one of the little images there has a Gibson girl balloon above the boat. So it was a part of the system. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much. So much for me personally, and I know lots of people watching will take a lot from it. I particularly was interested in the direction finding equipment. We've got a lot of people in our club interested in direction finding, obviously for leisure and for competition, and to see that that equipment there is fantastic. We've got a few questions already for you, but this is a good opportunity for you now to remind you at home now, if you've got any questions at all for Fred, I'll give him a quick break for a drink probably, and then we'll come straight in with them. So please ask them now, either on BATC or Facebook. So firstly, I think, Tammy, if I can just get that, sorry. Okay, so the first question comes from, it's a few parts to it, from Tom Miller. He says, was this equipment classed as secret? This is the first I've heard of it. Nothing of it at Bletchley Park either, which you might have heard of Bletchley Park. It's where our secret listening.
I've been there.
Good. Yeah, the secret listening station. So anyway, yeah, he asks, was it secret?
No, it wasn't. If you look at the manual, it says restricted, but that's say quite low level secret. The thing was that it would be pretty hard to keep it secret for very long, because any number of planes crashed in Germany, and they all would have a Gibson girl.
Yeah. That is yes, I guess so. There would have been plenty of people discovered it. But yeah. Tom also asks, what tubes and valves were used? I think you did mention the models actually of them, and how long did they take to start working? I.e., how long did the heater take to warm up?
About 15 to 20 seconds. So really not a big problem, because once you decided to crank, you'd want to crank for at least several minutes and to send out your messages. So 15 to 20 seconds wasn't a big loss. And of course, if you just stop for 30 seconds or a minute, then it's a little bit less. If the tubes are still fairly hot, the second time it's even shorter.
Do you know if there was any kind of like reservoir capacitor or anything there to take out any little blips of stopping, or was it just live from the generator all the time, and if you stopped, it would just instantly stop transmitting?
Well, it's like, as you probably know, many mains receivers, if they're playing and you suddenly pull a plug out of the wall or turn off the main switch, some of them will play for 5 or 10 or 15 seconds before they finally fade out, depending on, again, perhaps how big the filter capacitors are. But in this thing, there's no filter capacitors, which in a way for somebody who wants to get an older one working is nice, because the only capacitors in there are mica and air.
Yeah.
So
they're less likely to deteriorate, unlike electrolytics and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And finally, from Tom, he asked, what drives the speedo cable for the DF receiver?
Oh, well, it's one end is a crank. There's a little crank there, and you just turn that, and there's bevel gears usually. And this is very widely used in the American Deer because it enabled, for instance, for the small planes, they use these 3 little receivers and 2 little transmitters, and you could put them anywhere because you didn't have to, and so you didn't have to allow a large space for a radio. And so in some planes, if it was crowded, you might have 2 or 3 receivers in one place and the 2 transmitters somewhere else.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Fred. Now, Donard M0KRK has got a reasonably long question here, broken into 3 parts, so I'll try and join them together. Donard says, I've quite a long question connected with its history. Does Fred know anything about Marshall Killen, VE3KK? Marshall was Western Union, a Western Union electrician in Horta, but joined the RCAF and was one of the Canadian instructors at RAF Radio School, Cranwell, in 1944. Cranwell's in the UK, isn't it? Near Bedfordshire, I believe. He says that as Western Union cable electrician in Horta, he broke the terms of his radio amateur license and shifted frequency to work the Hindenburg in the 1930s. Hindenburg then diverted and flew over the Azores. He said, finally, I met Marshall in 1985 while on a visit to Newfoundland, and I diverted to Kitchener to interview him. So have you heard of Marshall?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. Sorry, I
no,
can't
that's
really.
Okay. Well, it may be useful to you to know that as well. Then that
it's an interesting story.
A fellow Canadian obviously made over to Bedfordshire, which, as you probably know, if you've been to Bletchley Park, is not that far from us here in Norfolk. We're probably about 60 or 70 miles away from there. Okay. Now, next question came from Martin, M0KXKM. The unknown Navy plane with 8M marking was a Fairey Barracuda, carrier-borne torpedo and dive bomber. So that may help you. I think you said you didn't know what type of aircraft that one was.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, no. Thank you very much. I appreciate knowing. And it makes a certain sense, because if it could efficiently carry something the weight of a torpedo, it could certainly carry a wooden boat.
Yes, sure. So it was if you want to make a note of this, and I can share it with you afterwards. Yeah. It's a Fairey with an E before the Y.
F-A-R-E-Y.
That's right, yeah. Okay. Martin G6WNN, why were they restricted to transmitting two lots of 3 minutes per hour?
Well, really for 2 reasons. One, to give the cranker in the life raft a break, because cranking for 20 minutes or 30 minutes would be an arduous undertaking, and in many cases, as time wore on, the people in life raft were getting weaker and weaker and less capable. The main reason was probably because it was a time when, and this was all law that was brought in after the disaster of the Titanic, that basically it said because even in World War II, at the time of the Titanic, both transmitters and receivers were extremely broad, as you probably know. They're pushing out sparks that, as somebody mentioned there, were almost DC to daylight. They had a little bit of tuning, so you had to be quiet for those 6 minutes out of the 60 minutes so that weak signals could be heard. So it's and of course the Gibson girl, many years more sophisticated still, was a weak signal, and to be heard, you had to have the big boys quiet down. Although in World War II, there was about 6 channels, most of them below 500. Radios were selective enough, so there was like 486 and 457, and other channels, but none right on 500 other than emergency use. But even so, having everybody quiet made it much easier to hear.
Yes, and of course those specific times. I mean, so I'm going to show my ignorance here. For that sort of time, though, were timepieces that accurate around about that time? Because we presumably, I don't know if they had quartz-controlled clocks and things in planes and things like that, but in that time?
Oh, I don't think so. But and of course, if you're trying to bang out the 4 seconds on, 1 second off sequence for the auto alarm, all you need is the probably the accuracy of an aviator's watch, because there was a little bit of slack in the response of the auto alarm. Plus, all you need is a second hand to be roughly accurate. In other words, if it's between, I don't know, 58 and 62 seconds, it's probably going to work to start the auto alarm.
Okay, thank you. Talking about the auto alarm, actually, Tony M0TDK says he believes the AA call is not the call of the transmitter station, but the call to an unknown station. Do you agree with that?
It can be either way. AA did it is what is your call, the query, and if somebody sends you that says I am an unknown station.
Okay, thank you. Mike G4DYC says, hi, great to hear the detail of this great rescue device. I'm not sure, but I think I did see a Gibson girl at a recent visit to Bletchley Park. Many thanks, Mike. So I think it was Martin earlier on who said he hadn't seen one there, I believe, or something. No, maybe I was quoting. It was Tom, sorry. Yeah, who said he hadn't seen one there. So have another look. We were actually at Bletchley Park just under a week ago, Tom, and they every time I go, they always make lots of changes, and there's new rooms and things operated. So maybe you'd see that there.
I remember. Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I was just going to say, I remember my time there. I spent, maybe an hour and a half in. It was the first hut number 1 for diplomatic messages or something like that. But there was an older, very knowledgeable ham there, and I looked at all sorts of wonderful things. A little steam engine for spy radios, where you'd have build your fire out in the woods, and you'd throw the boiler into the fire, and steam engine would spin up a dynamo, and you could send your messages. But anyway, it was full of lovely old things.
When did you go, Fred? Roughly?
That would have been 6 or 7 years ago now. Yeah,
it has changed. I mean, they're always building on, adding more onto it. So we were here there just 6 days ago, and it's changed even again. There's lots more to see. So I guess they've got a lot in storage, and it just takes a long time to get them out onto proper displays. So well worth a visit if you haven't done this. I'm just going to mention this now to our members, and if you are, by the way, I will mention as well now, if you're a member of the RSGB, it doesn't cost you anything to get in, but you do need to download a voucher before you go, but that saves something like £25 to get in, so well worth it. If you've never been to Bletchley Park, strongly recommended. Really fascinating place.
It's a treat.
Absolutely, yeah. I've got so Martin M0XKM has also come back and says it looks like the Norfolk Tank Museum radio collection also has an orange Gibson girl on display. So obviously, you know, Fred, we're in Norfolk, and there is a tank museum not very far away from where we are, probably about 20 miles away. So if anybody wants to see one and they don't want to go to Bletchley Park, then they could go to the Norfolk Tank Museum. I've got one other question for you. So if you're waiting at home now to ask a question, you need to do it right now, either on Facebook or BATC, and I'll read it to Fred. This one comes from Malcolm G3PDH, who says, very interesting. As a seagoing radio op in the Merchant Navy in the 1960s, our lifeboat units, possibly, I'm not sure what that is, units were very similar still. We had to check them out from time to time. The auto alarm used to false alarm a lot in the tropics with long static crashes and bursts, sounding the alarm in my cabin in the night. Surprised the DF worked on HF, as always difficult due to multipath effects, he says.
Yeah, that sounds very, very plausible.
Yeah, I must admit, I was mentioning that we have a lot of people interested in direction finding. We use 2 meters, so that's rather easier to build some quite, you know,
Oh, yes.
sharp direction finding. But to do that on HF, or let alone 500 kilohertz, you know, that's amazing. That was where they used the loop, wasn't it? You said.
Yes, that's right. And yeah, the loops work quite well down at that frequency, but yeah, there's a lot of problems. I mean, you could have a lot of static would interfere. Anyway, they certainly appeared to. I would love to have found records of exactly how many people were rescued using it, but I don't think they kept that kind of record. I mean, the crew was a plane went in, ditched, and if they got the crew back, of course, that was recorded, but not whether the Gibson girl was essential to that particular rescue.
No, I think the poster as well you showed on one of your slides, that was having something like 300. I think he was just moving the needle, wasn't he, to 300?
Yeah, it was at I think 262, but anyway, yeah, around 300. But that was, well, it's the sort of thing, of course, they do in the military to let you know that you're doing something worthwhile. You know, and it was. And another interesting thing, which I don't know much about, is the relationship between those fast boats that went out to rescue downed flyers in the Channel and in the North Sea to your wonderful rescue boat system around Britain now. We've been over a number of times, and we stopped in at some of the.
Is it the RNLI? RNLI?
RNLI. That's what I was trying to think. I'm getting a little foggy. I'm turning 77 in about a week, and so things come a little more slowly now. But anyway, yeah, I've stopped in, and it's amazing. But apparently, the techniques which were developed and the boats which were developed at this time by Britain that had a lot of input to the RNLI system.
I was struck myself personally, by the way, by the condition of the electronics and everything inside yours. I mean, even the joints were shiny and everything. Have you done anything with that, or does that how that actually looked when you opened it?
No, that's just the way it looked. The outside has got a variety of dents and scrapes and the usual things which happen. And they made them out of, and I think by design, they made them out of quite a soft aluminum, so that if somebody whacked it with a hammer, I would expect it to continue working. You'd have an unpleasant looking dent, but the dent absorbs the energy, doesn't transfer it to the electronics.
Yeah, and I guess as long as the paint's still there, it won't corrode very much either. It certainly won't rust, will it? Excellent.
Yeah, and as I said, I've encountered a number of them, and if they're not really abused, you crank them and they work. It's quite impressive, really. Yeah. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. I want to ask you a question. And have you heard of Artie Moore?
I haven't personally. No, I don't know if any of our viewers have. Artie Moore.
Okay. Yeah, he was a young Welsh fellow in 1912. He lived in a place called Blackwood in the Gelly Grows grist mill, and he was a ham. His father ran the mill, and he worked for his father in the mill, and he got interested in radio in about 1910. And he set up a typical spark system for the time in the attic of the mill. And he was up there listening one night in April 1912, and he heard an SOS and started listening. He was a good CW operator, and he heard all the last messages from the Titanic. And if now Marconi, Guillermo Marconi himself said that he believed that the 5 kilowatt synchronous transmitter, which the Titanic had a maximum range at night of about 2,400 miles. Well, Gelly Grows Blackwood, which is about 12 miles north of Cardiff, is 3,000 miles from where the Titanic went down. And this young fellow got clean copy on all the messages. He got so excited, so he ran down to the police station. And they basically laughed at him and said, well, run home, young fella, and go to bed, and you'll feel better in the morning. And apparently, to his intense satisfaction, they got the paper the next morning, and of course, the Titanic had sunk. And Marconi heard about this, so he went to visit Moore. Arthur Moore was his proper name, and he decided this young guy had potential. So he hired him. The Marconi company trained him. And he worked his whole life. He retired in the late 40s, but he actually was instrumental in developing what's called the Puff Duff, the HFDF system, which the British used in World War II. And so, anyway, it was before that. I mentioned in the talk that there were. It was in the trials of the Titanic up off Northern Ireland. They had contacted Tenerife, but that's about what was it, 1,900 miles, and they also contacted Port Said, which actually was about 2,600 miles. So that was very good. But anyway, the 3,000 miles was, and of course, there's a picture of it, which actually, let me just see if I don't. Yeah, here it is. I stuck it in. This is his station.
Okay, so can we show that, Tammy? We're just going to go to a different mode now. We're showing both of us on a picture at the moment, so Fred. So just bear with us a moment before you talk about it, and we'll bring this up. There we are.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so at the top there is this. His call was MNX. This back at this time they didn't put any numbers in calls, and if you look at here, what you see most of is the transmitter. You see it's got the old spark coil in the middle. And unfortunately, if you look over on the left-hand side below the picture, you'll see there's something there. And I took the picture and I lightened it. And this is what's called a loose coupler. And this was a standard receiver of the day. So he received over the 3,000 miles with this loose coupler and some kind of diode, some crystal or galena or whatever he used. I don't know, but this is his station, and so the longest distance covered by the Titanic's transmitter was between the Titanic and back to England or Wales. If you want to make the distinction.
Great Britain. We'll call it Great Britain to not
Great
be
Britain.
controversial.
Okay, there we go.
Yes. No,
Please,
that
everybody.
is good. And actually, for those of you watching on BATC, you'll see that Roger G3LDI has put a link on there to a story that's in Wales Online. So if you're interested to read more about Artie Moore, then you can look at the link that Roger has put onto BATC. If you're on Facebook, then by all means have a look over there. Oh, actually, Tammy's now going to paste that onto Facebook as well, so that everybody is watching it on Facebook has got that as well. It's been a delight, and once again, a really interesting talk, Fred. Thank you very much for this evening. We've got lots of good comments and likes for this, as you can imagine. Tom Miller has said, thank you, Fred, for an interesting and absorbing lecture on the Gibson girl and all the associated material. It's really yet another story, and I didn't realise there was so much with our country, to Great Britain involved with it as well. So thank you very much indeed for your time and some wonderful pictures tonight. Oh, I hope we haven't lost you. No, there we are.
Yeah. Anyway, so the antenna came out of the attic of the mill, crossed the river, went through the forest and up a hill to a large field. And as far as I can figure out, the antenna was up to about 90 feet above the mill and was about 1,000 feet long. So, and there wouldn't have been much radio interference in those days. No. So anyway, he did it, and I kind of liked the thought of bringing him back into the light there.
Absolutely, you have, certainly. And what I'll do as well, Fred, I'll link you with this as well. I'll send you a quick email with the link that Roger's found with this story on there as well. So once again, thank you ever so much. It's been really good to see you again, and thank you for a fascinating and interesting talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, my apologies about the troubles with the computer.
Don't worry.
I'm better with old technology than new technology.
Well, next time when we meet, we'll use valves and stuff like that, and it will all work flawlessly, okay. I'm sure. Thank you ever so much, Fred.
Right. Thanks so much, David. It was a pleasure.
Best wishes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Anyway, what a fascinating story that really was. I thought we'd be in for a good one. I mean, the Titanic one was great, and I remember when you voted on your favourite talks of the year, Titanic was right up there, and I'm sure this will be one of the great memories as well of 2023 as well. So lots of people saying thanks very much to Fred. That's about it for this NARC Live. Just a reminder what's happening in the club this coming week. We've got on Sunday, we've got the GB2RS News on GB3MB at 7 o'clock. 7:30 the Monday Night Net on GB3MB on Monday. And at 8 o'clock the 80 metre CW net on 3.543 megahertz. And then next Wednesday, November the 29th, we'll be meeting at CNS School between 7 and 9:30. Where we've got a social, we've got an informal Raspberry Pi session, and also don't forget what Donard asked for, some information about and any equipment or tips you've got for how to find a fault in a long piece of cable. That would be really appreciated if you can bring something. And if you're just interested in the solutions, I hope we'll have people bringing solutions as well. So come and have a look at that. That's all though for now. Don't forget to keep in touch with your pictures and your stories and those mystery items that allow us to carry on with our What on Earth competition. But until next time, from Tammy M0TC.
All right.
And from me, David G7URP, look after yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.